right, Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on, Jeff.
So you're a certified fisheries professional. That sounds like an awesome title, just ambiguous enough to be mysterious and interesting. What does that entail?
Yeah, so that's what I have in my email signature. And so there's sort of a professional organization for fish biologists called the American Fisheries Society. And you can get accreditation through them, get that sort of certification. But basically, I took some study for fish biology, did my undergrad and master's degree at University of Alaska Fairbanks in fisheries. And then I actually went over to New Zealand to do my doctorate in freshwater ecology over there. But yeah, that little bit at the end of my email signature is sort of a generic thing that's a kind of like a professional organization, I guess, credit sort of thing. So it tells people that I am authorized to study fish, basically.
Nice. Did you get to study some of those brown trout and rainbow trout in New Zealand? Because I've seen some travel videos there, and that seems like just an awesome place to go fish.
Yeah, a lot of my work was looking at how those non-native species like the trout interact with the native small species called galaxids there, which are sort of these little, they call them sort of pencil fish that live in the rocks and that sort of thing. The trout like chowing down on them. So there are some impacts to those native fish from the trout. And then also they have these huge eels, catadromous eels that live there in the rivers. And so those actually eat the trout. But it was fun studying the dynamics between those native and non-native fish. And I was looking at how things like pastoral cover, where farming was being done, impacted sort of the food web around those fish. So
Wow.
super cool part of my life. But yeah, I kind of, started in Alaska with my fish studies, went to New Zealand, and then Alaska brought me back. There's just so many amazing questions about our fish here in Alaska, like things that are totally unknown still, that really intrigue me and get me excited about checking out places and seeing new fish. So.
I know some people are really excited about the science of what they do, and they don't allow for a lot of enjoyment, whereas it looks like you're definitely an avid angler as well.
Yeah, that's true. I've known some fish biologists that don't fish, and that's crazy to me. So I don't really trust people that, study fish or wildlife and don't actually go out there and hunt or fish themselves. I don't, see where their motivations are. So I definitely love to be out there, fishing and hunting and just seeing those animals that I'm also studying as well.
So you wrote an article for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership about trekking for pumpkin char above the Arctic Circle. And I've been up in that area once, went across at or over Adigan Pass, and I was just thinking, I can't imagine what this is like, because it's a fairly wide road, but it's gravel, and it seems like it would just be terrible when it's snowing. So when you went up there in October of a couple of years ago, what was that drive like? My drive in August was pretty wide open. It was super nice. It had snowed the week before, but it kind of got completely melted out. But what was that like in October?
Yeah, it was a little bit scary. I think every time I go over that Adigan Pass, there's something, whether it's like fog or just, that gumbo mud that can happen with a lot of rain or just a huge snowstorm. And I've been through there kind of during all seasons. So in the wintertime, I go up over that pass to go up on the North Slope, snowmobile out, and study fish that are overwintering in rivers out there, way out near Prudhoe Bay. So going up over there in the winter is, a different story. But yeah, going up in October, it's tough because a lot of the motorists are like not prepared for the snow.
Right.
So even the big trucks are, sort of spinning their wheels as you go up that pass, and you're trying to go up, but you're sort of stuck behind them. They're peeling out, and you don't really want to go around because you can't see what's around the next bend. You don't want another big truck coming down at you. Luckily, with my work truck, we have a CB radio, so we can say like, four wheel, that they call us four wheels, like on the Dalton Highway there, and 16 wheelers coming up the pass, coming around the truckers. Like that's a good way to communicate. But when I'm doing a personal trip, like the pumpkin char trip, I'm just sort of trying to be pretty conservative around those big trucks and in those tough conditions. But yeah, when I went up there, this was a few years ago now, and I had this like abdominal surgery that sort of put me out of commission for the best part of the hunting season, August and September. And I was just itching to get out there, and I finally felt like I was ready to go around the 1st of October. And I kind of said, screw it. I'm going to go up there and try anyway, even though the lakes might be almost frozen. I knew there was snow on the ground. I just gave it a shot anyhow, and it worked out and made for some amazing storytelling and beautiful pictures as well. These bright orange char in the snow up there. But yeah, there's this satellite browser you can look at. It's called Copernicus, and so you can actually look at that and see imagery from just a few days prior, and it's free. So I use that a lot, and I was looking at those lakes where I wanted to go for these pumpkin char, the bright orange char, and I could see some of the lakes were just starting to freeze over, and some of the bigger ones were still open. So I was like, okay, I've got a tiny little window left. This was right around October 1st, and I figured I'd go up and give it a shot, and it worked out. And yeah, happy to chat more about that. Especially about the difference between Arctic char, which is what I was fishing for there, and the Dolly Varden, which are a similar species that you also find up in the same area. So,
Right. Yeah. What is the difference there? That's a good segue into because I was going to ask you about that. There isn't really a pumpkin char. It's just like the name for the color of the fish. It's not like a subspecies or anything like that, right?
that's right. Yeah. So it's just the Arctic char, and I'm sort of one of those people that I get caught in by the pumpkin spice craze in the fall time. So thinking of that as I was driving up there, and I was like, this is like a pumpkin spice char. It's a bright orange, but yeah. So there are these two species of fish, Arctic char and Dolly Varden. And in Alaska, how we differentiate them is that Dolly Varden are found in rivers and the Arctic char are found in lakes. Oftentimes, the Dolly Varden are anadromous, so they swim back and forth between the freshwaters to spawn and then out in the oceans to feed. And then the Arctic char are largely just freshwater resident. They always stay in the lakes. There's some exceptions to that. I think down in Bristol Bay, where there's been some evidence that certain Arctic char will go out into the ocean a little bit, and other places in the world. Both these Arctic char and Dolly Varden, they occur in Canada, Russia, Scandinavia. There's even Arctic char in Scotland, surprisingly, which is kind of cool. And they're sort of like, if you talk to a geneticist, they say that the Arctic char and the Dolly Varden are so closely related, like it's really hard to tell the difference genetically. So there's kind of a lot of overlap between those two. But in Alaska, it's the Dolly Varden in the rivers and the Arctic char in the lakes.
Okay. What about a bull trout? Is that similar enough to be mentioned with those other two, or is it kind of its own thing and quite a bit different? Because they do have
Yeah,
similar,
that's
like you
another.
look at them, they look kind of somewhat similar.
Totally, yeah. And so I grew up in northwest Montana where we have a lot of bull trout, and they're in the same genus. So it's the genus Salvelinus. It's the same one as like brook trout, bull trout, lake trout, Dolly Varden, Arctic char. All those are in the same genus, and they can basically all interbreed if the conditions come about where they're together in the same place where they're spawning. So you can get like a bull trout Dolly Varden hybrid in some circumstances. That's been documented in Alaska. But we don't have as many bull trout up here in Alaska. They occur down in Southeast Alaska in certain rivers. I forget which ones. I'm not as familiar as with Southeast, but they are around. We don't have them up in interior Alaska. And then, of course, there's where I'm from, they're adfluvial, which means they move between lakes and rivers, and they always stay in freshwater.
Mhm.
The bull trout and the Dolly Varden, they can go in and out of salt and fresh water. So they have what we say, they have like plastic life histories. They kind of do whatever the heck they want sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Down here in Southeast, the dolly fishing in tidewaters is pretty fun. There's a really extensive network of little creeks and little freshwater stuff. And then you got salmon being released from the hatcheries. And so in Juneau, there's a really strong tidewater Dolly Varden fishery, which is pretty cool. You can get some pretty nice fish.
Yeah, I worked as a fish technician in Glacier Bay National Park for 2 summers right after I moved up from Montana, and I really loved going after the dollies. It was like a totally totally new fish for me coming from landlocked Montana. So I had a great time doing that. I ended up, catching and keeping dollies, and people were always saying, like, "Oh, why would you ever eat those things when you can catch salmon?" But coming from Montana, they tasted great, and
Right.
I really enjoyed catching them. They were kind of all over the place and available any time of the year, them and the cutthroat trout. So those were some of the first fish I really enjoyed catching when I moved to Alaska. And I have such a fond place in my heart for them. And if you look at like the Alaska Department of Fish and Game map that shows where they are in Alaska, those dollies are pretty much everywhere in the state except for some very interior regions where there's not so many. So they are, super adaptable. You can find them down in Southeast Alaska. You can find them up on the Arctic slope, like we're talking about today. So I love these fish. They're awesome fish and beautiful fish too.
What's your rod setup for targeting those fish on the North Slope?
Yeah, so there's two different. Well, for the Arctic char in the lakes, I like to go with maybe a 7 weight because you can hook into a pretty good sized Arctic char, up to maybe 10 pounds if you get really lucky. It's more like 1 to 4 pounds is what you're going to find, but they're very hard fighters. They kind of just like bull trout. They get their name where they dive deep. They're strong. They'll put up a really good fight, and they're not like a pike where you fight them for 30 seconds or a minute and they kind of give up. They'll put on a dogged fight for a few minutes. So I like to have a pretty stout rod. Also up there on the slope, you can get into some real windy times, and so if you have a stouter rod, you could cast out further with these char. It's really cool if you go up in like September and October, like this pumpkin char trip. They are bright orange, and so you go out to these lakes, which are crystal clear. And the first time I did it, I brought a pack raft along, and I thought I'd troll around out in the lake, but I just ended up walking along the bank, and it looked like a traffic cone swimming along. You could see these orange fish just coming through, and so it was awesome sight fishing. And so the technique that I really recommend is just working along the banks and casting out sight fish if you can, or just blind fish with big streamers, maybe a little bit of weight on them. And the fish will come in. They're pretty aggressive at that time of year, September, October. I talked to some friends who fished like in June and July for these Arctic char up on the slope, and they found them to be really tricky. Like they had to use smaller nymph patterns, and they would see them come by and refuse to fly. And they're also not as colorful at that time. September and October is the time to find them because they're in that beautiful spawning coloration. That fall time is when they're spawning. So that's the time to go. You also don't have to deal with mosquitoes. They're in September and October. And October is kind of getting into like you're going to be close to those lakes freezing. So I definitely recommend September. You're still going to find some poor weather probably. August will be okay, but those fish are not going to be quite as colorful as they will be a little later on. So yeah, that's for the Arctic char. For the Dolly Varden, you're fishing for them in the rivers. It depends on the size of the Dolly Varden that you're going after. Some of them can get up to 20 pounds if you get really lucky and find one like in the Ivashak River, which is known for really large dollies. So you'd want at least an 8 weight for those fish. And in the bigger rivers, they can go downstream, use the current, take a lot of line. So I think an 8 weight or maybe even a little bigger just to be safe would be good for them. But all of them, the char and the dollies are very aggressive. So just big streamers. I like anything that's sort of articulated with rabbit fur. I found the char don't necessarily like the more drab colors. So like the olive, the black, I would be fishing for them in the lake. You could see them. They would follow the fly all the way into the shore, and they just wouldn't commit. They wouldn't bite. They might nibble at the tail a little bit. But when I put on like some really terrible salmon streamer, like bright purple or bright green or something, they would just nail that. So just bring, a whole bunch of different streamers. These fish, if you find them, that's the challenge, right? Trying to find them. Once you find them, they're going to be pretty aggressive on most anything you toss their way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty wild. You think you want to, in the fly fishing realm, you want to imitate something that happens in nature. And a lot of the Alaska fly boxes, there's nothing at all like that. It's just the bright colors and something that's going to instigate a strike. Does not occur in nature whatsoever.
Yeah, that always blows my mind because as a biologist, I'm like, well, what is this fish eating? What are its motivations for biting this, right? And then that all goes out the window when they bite something crazy like a big pink streamer. So
yeah, I guess humans are pretty similar in that some of the things that we eat do not occur in nature naturally. So I guess we can.
Yeah, sometimes I see those like brightly colored zebra cakes or something at the store, and they catch my eye. So.
For sure. Don't need it, but it's hard to say no sometimes. So when you're heading up there, is there anything else you consider? Anything else you bring as far as gear goes? If someone's wants to take their truck up there, are you looking at chains? Are you bringing extra sand in case you get stuck? Are you getting like some special contraption for extra traction? What are you doing gear wise to ensure safe travel?
Yeah, well, it's definitely good to have a full size spare. There are tire repair facilities in Coldfoot, which is sort of halfway up that road, and also at the Yukon River Camp. So, but they're not always open, and you're not always going to be able to get service quickly. So I think being as self-sufficient as possible with your vehicle, bring a couple extra 5-gallon gas cans. I always have to do that because you can only get fuel at a few places, Yukon River, Coldfoot, and then the oil fields up in Prudhoe Bay. And what I'm doing is kind of in between Coldfoot and Prudhoe Bay. So I'm going back and forth a lot. Maybe I'm hunting, maybe I'm hiking out for fishing. So I need some extra gas usually. So I bring some extra fuel. Always good to bring one of those nice tow straps to, help yourself out or others. If somebody gets into that gumbo that can happen up there, just wanders off the road or something. And then, Yeah, I think those inReach devices or other satellite communicator devices are really helpful these days, just in case anything goes wrong, a breakdown or whatever. You can get a hold of somebody to relay the message or come help out. And yeah, try to think what else. If I'm going in September or later, I usually bring a dry suit if I'm going to be on the water, just because the weather can be really cold, really miserable, wind, rain, just kind of bone chilling. And so I'd rather just be happy as a clam in the dry suit rather than trying to kind of use a combination of rain pants or waders or coats where there's these little areas where the water gets in. You don't think it will, but it does. And so I've gone on a pack raft trip up there along the Sagavanirktok River. I was in a dry suit. My companion was in rain gear and waders, and he was shivering and cold by the end of our float that day. And I was just super, warm and happy. And obviously, you feel more confident to go out and hunt or fish if you're feeling better and more warm. I just like, it doesn't need to be a survival situation. I like to be,
Right.
kind of warm and happy
Yeah.
out there. So definitely recommend that.
Do you have an Arctic oven, or what are you doing for camp?
I just use like a lightweight sort of mountain hunting tent. In the wintertime when we're out there, we do bring Arctic ovens and stoves and stuff. But most of the stuff I'm doing, I'm trying to be pretty lightweight. So going out there with those small, like 1 or 2 person tents, I have a Kuiu tent with now, which I like a lot, and it holds up really well to the wind and rain. Definitely test your gear before you go out.
Right.
I made the mistake of I stored my gear for the winter, and a little bit of moisture was in my tent bag or something, and I guess the seams sort of degraded a bit. So the first time I took it out in the summer in a big rainstorm, I got really wet in the tent. So try not to be complacent, and take it out for a little test run. Set up your tent in your backyard, spray your hose on it or something. Make sure that nothing's getting in there, because you want to be focusing on your hunt or your fishing trip rather than being miserable and just trying to prepare about how to get out and how to warm back up.
Yeah. I definitely want fishing stories and hunting stories. I don't want survival stories. I'd rather it
Exactly.
just be as boring as possible in that regard. The new technology is so great. It's so nice to be able to come back and recalibrate, just get out of the cold, warm up a little bit, and even if you have to feed it nonstop because a lot of those stoves are pretty small, it's just totally worth it. So nice to be able to do that.
Yeah, some friends that, especially people that fly in where they have a little more capacity to bring some weight, that sort of thing, and then doing a float trip out, they bring those sort of like teepee type tents with a little stove. That's got to be so nice for drying out some gear in these places where it's really hard to start a fire. There's no spruce on the Arctic slope where I'm doing a lot of this stuff, and so trying to light a fire with these little willows and dry things out. Usually, it's raining just as fast as and making things more wet just as fast as it dries it out. So
Yeah.
having those little stoves would be an awesome thing to do for sure.
So that's the fun part of your time in that area. There's also been a work part, a study part. So can it give you a little bit of background on the fish studies that you've done, what you were looking for? When I was up there, it was incredible to see that the Dalton Highway ran pretty parallel, and it seemed like it was as minimal as it could be as far as being obtrusive or degrading the habitat. I mean, anytime you have any sort of building or structure or human footprint there, it's going to degrade the habitat to a degree. But it seemed like things were in, pretty good shape. What did you find in your studies?
Yeah, that's true. So what I looked at was I studied maybe 7 water bodies along the Dalton Highway for sort of the Canute River north to Toolik Lake area, and looked at mercury, zinc, copper, PFAS, which is a human-made contaminant, just to see what levels were there. Was that Dalton Highway and Trans-Alaska Pipeline, which has been there for 40 years or so now, does it show much effect on our aquatic environments? Are there elevated levels of these contaminants? Because there's not much studies in this area previously, we don't really know what was there before. So these studies that I did, I'm getting this information. And it could be that if I find like elevated levels of mercury or something, it could be from natural geologic sources too. It might not necessarily be from the Dalton Highway. So we looked at sites along the Dalton Highway where there's a lot of industrial impact. And then we looked at rivers out in Western Brooks Range, the Alatna, the John, the Kobuk, the Koyukuk, to sort of as a control to compare between areas where there's a lot less industrial footprint and then areas where there's been 40 years of trucking and, sort of oil oil industry service and that sort of thing, mining there as well. So yeah, what we found was that as you'd expect, the levels of things like mercury and zinc were slightly elevated along the Dalton Highway in fish, in sediment, in aquatic vegetation, that sort of thing. Not in every place, and not to any level that would be concerning for human health, which is good. But it certainly does show a likely impact. It could be from natural geological sources as well, compared to these rivers out in the Western Brooks Range, where we basically found completely pristine ecosystems with no elevated levels of anything, which we would hope for. Although there's so many sources, natural sources of contaminants like permafrost melting, there's a lot of mercury that comes out of that sometimes. And fish will take that in through the food web and it sort of builds up over time. That's called bioaccumulation. So some of the pike we found, they're known to sort of carry a lot of those contaminants. Some of them had mercury levels that would be for pregnant women and children. It would reach this level where they would want to limit their number of meals per month. And the state of Alaska gives really good guidelines depending on the amount of mercury in the pike flesh or the fish flesh as to how many meals per month. And so it was still really high. It was like 16 or 12 meals per month at the levels we found in the pike along the Dalton and the outer western Brooks Range rivers there. But yeah, everything was looking really healthy, even along the Dalton Highway, except for one place we found elevated levels of PFAS, which are these man-made chemicals that are found in firefighting foam. They were often stored, practiced, used in areas where there's petroleum usage. So we found in one lake near one of the pump stations, it's called T Lake. It's right by the Adigan River on the north side, that there was higher levels of these PFAS compounds in Arctic grayling, burbot, and whitefish. So that was concerning. The state of Alaska right now doesn't have like a level where they say that's too much of that chemical and people shouldn't eat it. But these levels that we found would sort of trigger warnings, like, for example, in the European Union or other states in the US where they do have advisories like that. So there's certainly, places where we have found these impacts along the Dalton Highway, but everything looks amazing. And fish look really great. The environments look really great further out west in the Brooks Range where there's less environmental impact. But, I thought that I would find a lot more impact from the Dalton Highway, 40 years of that being there, all the dust getting up in the air from the constant trucks, there are certainly have been oil spills and that sort of thing along there, brake dust, things, like chemicals in the brakes that get ground down and get into the air, into the water. Those are all things that could slowly contribute to higher contaminant levels. But it all looked, quite good, except for just a few places where we found those elevated levels.
So someone might listen to that and misconstrue it or think that it validates the building of the Ambler Road, the 211 miles. But the people I've talked to say there's a huge difference between running parallel to a river and when you have multiple river crossings along the entire watershed area. So what is the potential environmental impact? Because that was essentially your control area. That was your area of pristine waters. And now that is at risk for having that 211-mile road.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the other big difference between the Ambler Road and the Dalton Highway is that the Ambler Road, they would actually be trucking ore. So it's very similar to the Red Dog Road. So there's these big trucks. They say there might be 168 per day going across this Ambler Road, which cuts 200 miles across from east to west across the Brooks Range. And so this ore is being trucked. And so they've looked at is the Ambler Road, the Red Dog Road, which has a similar haul road. It's shorter. It's like 65 miles. It also goes east to west in this similar area. And they truck ore out to a port there. And they found through studies that actually this dust from the ore escapes from the truck and it contaminates the tundra with cadmium, lead, and zinc out to half a kilometer out from the road. Luckily, that Red Dog Road doesn't cross many streams of importance, especially when we look at anadromous waters, which are like specially designated waters where we know salmon or sheefish or other species that are really important, for subsistence and for sport fishing. They cross back and forth. And so those ones have extra protections. But for the Ambler Road, it would cross 3,000 streams and many of these anadromous waters, I think 5 or 6 wild and scenic rivers, including like the Kobuk, the Alatin, the Koyukuk, the John. And just downstream of these crossings are really important spawning areas for salmon and for sheefish, especially in the Kobuk and the Alatin rivers. So yeah, the difference is there's a lot more crossings when you're going east to west compared to the Dalton Highway, which is just north and south. So it kind of follows the river courses. It's not crossing over so many And so the problem is, each place where this road would cross, that's an opportunity for this fugitive ore dust, it's called, to get into the waters. All that travels downstream, gets into the food web, and you start getting this bioaccumulation, more and more of contaminants like mercury, zinc, cadmium, which is not only harmful for fish, but also for the people that eat the fish too. So that's the difference there. It's mainly that this ore is being hauled, unlike the Dalton Highway, which is simply, it's like cargo traffic and that sort of thing, and the public that's traveling that. So yeah, I think hopefully that explains it well, sort of the difference there and why there's a higher level of concern with the Ambler Road compared to this Dalton Highway.
Yeah, I think I guess the optimistic view was, okay, you build the road, you do a good job on the culverts, and barring some sort of spill, it could be pretty preserved, and that the ore dust, that makes a ton of sense, and also just shows just how much more degrading that would be to the habitat and just how much worse that would be.
Yeah, it's true, and it's good that we have that example with the Red Dog Road, and there's also some really good studies that show impacts to caribou from that road as well. So I'm not as well versed on that subject, but they've GPS collared caribou and then seen how they interacted with that Red Dog Road, and actually found that there's quite a bit of hesitation in the migrations across that. Some of these caribou are, backing off because of all the war truck. Like a lot of people say, oh, it's just a road. Caribou cross the road all the time, no big deal. They do it on the Dalton Highway too, but these ore trucks would be 168 trips per day. You get all the dust that's coming up, the noise from that. That's certainly going to have an impact on these caribou, which are migrating north to south in their migration. So they're directly intersecting the road. So yeah, those studies from that Red Dog Road with the caribou also give us a good indication of what we can expect with, not only the fish impact, but the terrestrial animal impact as well. And with that, it's the Western Arctic caribou herd that's sort of in question there. It's been declining for a few years, and now non-resident hunters are sort of been closed out of there. So it's a place where we probably don't need a lot more pressures, on that herd at the moment. And also, local folks, indigenous folks, are having trouble filling their freezers with that herd too. And, I think about all these rivers that this Ambler Road would cross. All these rivers are struggling with their Chinook salmon, and with the Kobuk River, the chum salmon too. There's like people out in the villages aren't even able to go out and use their fish wheels or their nets these days because those runs are so low. And if we have just additional stressors on that, that's not going to help, I don't think. And I don't know if it's worth the risks. Obviously, there's potential benefits with something like the Ambler Road. I think, personally, they're pretty speculative because this ore would need to be trucked first 200 miles to the Dalton Highway, 200 miles to Fairbanks, put on a railroad, 400 miles down to the coast. Then it would be shipped to Canada or Asia to be smelted. Like, I don't know how much economic benefit, after all the costs there are calculated, we're going to be getting. And then the companies that are doing this are Canadian and Australian. So, and also, the state has already put in a bunch of money to, through AIDA, which is the Alaska Industrial Export Authority. Sort of, it's like this semi-public corporation that invests in things in Alaska, these big mega projects. They've already put tens of millions of dollars into this road. Who knows if they'll recoup that? They'll likely have to put more. So yeah, from both the economic side of it, I'm pretty dubious about that. And then I'm also worried about those risks. With the Ambler Road, there's also these 4 mines that could go in, and we know that mines can have problems. There's lots of recent examples of that, like big tailing dam failures that wipe out whole rivers, and just the slow creep of contaminants as well, even if there's no big spill. So a lot of doom and gloom, but for a place that I've gone out to, like the Kobuk River and stuff, to catch sheefish, it's my favorite place in the world and such an amazing area. And as a hunter and angler, it's not worth the risks for me. Maybe if I was employed by a mining company or industry, I'd have a different point of view, but that's kind of where I sit on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's look at everything in the state and look at our economic system, or our financial problems that we have, and how much money we would make off oil and the investments off the oil, and how little, like as much as tourism is extremely important to local economies, as far as taxable income that the state can then use for the budget, there's not much. And it doesn't seem like would be benefiting Alaskans. So when people say, yeah, let's drill, or we should be drilling, or we should be mining, we should open this up, it's not really it's not going to be like the Alaskan people who really benefit from this. It's going to be particular people who are in with the interests and then foreign entities that are owning these mining companies. So it's really hard to, you try to be as objective as possible and look at everything, but man, this thing shakes out bad every way you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Fairbanks, right next like Fort Knox Gold Mine, Pogo Gold Mine. Those mining companies do a lot of great things for the community. They have their problems too. They've each had, environmental breaches, but those, they get fined and they fix those up. And so I'm not anti-mining or anything, but this just seems like a poor idea for the Ambler. And
Right.
yeah, just cutting through Gates of the Arctic National Park. I grew up in Montana next to the Bob Marshall Wilderness Glacier National Park. So I kind of explained it to folks like, well, what if somebody wanted to put a road through Glacier Park or through the Bob Marshall Wilderness to go out and access some mines that may or may not be developed? And so when I put it that way, like nobody in Montana, where I come from, would ever want something like that to happen. And so hopefully that resonates a little bit. Alaskans, we see things a little different because there's so much federal land locked up and that sort of thing. But this Gates of the Arctic area and Brooks Range is, I mean, it's an incredible place. And I hope that everybody gets a chance to go out there and fish and hunt. I've had so many epic adventures. I hear a lot like you have to be rich to fly out there and to utilize those areas. But I've done some really cool trips flying in for like $200 on little commercial village flights to Anaktuvuk Pass and pack rafting through Gates of the Arctic and stuff. So it's totally accessible if you just do a little logistical work and that sort of thing. And I hope that, people can see the value of that place and how special it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly not available for everyone because it is a little bit more expensive, but it is something like you said that just takes some logistical planning. And if you're like trying to do fly out to these areas to do caribou hunting, then that's going to be expensive. So some different type things to consider. But yeah, it's just because you can't always access it doesn't mean that it's not worth saving, and you don't know what happens in the future.
Yeah, and I think it's more accessible than people think. And also, that brings us around to the Dalton Highway and how great of a caribou hunting access that is for both residents and non-residents. And so there's some stuff going on there now too, which there was the Central Yukon Resource Management Plan that was sort of set up, passed in 2024, this new plan that would basically maintain hunters and anglers access to all these lands right around the Dalton Highway where so many of us go out and hike out for caribou, or like the pumpkin char. I was out in these lands, I hiked out about 5 miles into these BLM lands that are a part of the Central Yukon Resource Management Plan that's trying to be, the administration right now is trying to roll it back and potentially open up those areas for, land management transfer, land management change, land use change. So I think it's important to talk about that too. I mean, as far as accessible caribou opportunities in Alaska, that Dalton Highway, some people love it, some people hate it because there's its challenges, but that access right now is something that we need to fight for too, because this resource management plan is potentially being rolled back. And then there's this opportunity for these lands to suddenly have fences put up if they're leased out, if the land is transferred to private companies or whatever. So I'm pretty worried about that myself, just because I go up there and utilize those lands so much. So that's in Congress right now, as this rollback of the Central Yukon Resource Management Plan, which was approved in 2024 and gave sportsmen and industry as well a really good compromise for how those lands were going to be utilized. So we can talk more about that, but
Yeah, go
the
for it.
Central Yukon, the Central Yukon plan. So it covers a huge amount of land. It's like 13 million acres, like half the size of Indiana. And it's like from Fairbanks north up to like the Toolik Lake area, all the BLM lands, particularly along the Dalton Highway, and then out towards Galena, Alaska, all the BLM lands out that way, particularly around like the Nowitna River, Koyukuk River. So yeah, all these are kind of under review right now. And so the current administration is rolling back this 2024 plan that was put into place after about a decade of public comment, scoping, scientists, outdoorsmen, industry representatives all had a say in what went into this plan. So it was a really cool, I guess, example of like collaborative resource management and setting up something that was similar to what was there in the past. There was a plan since 1986 or so that allowed for a lot of great hunting and fishing opportunities up there without opening things up too much. And so this kind of continued that, but also took away a few of the protected areas like Sukakpak Mountain and Community Hot Springs that could potentially be opened up to responsible resource use. It was a really good compromise, and unfortunately, it's sort of in Congress right now, potentially being rolled back. And so, yeah, wanted to mention that too, because it's something we should, if you've ever hunted the Dalton Highway for caribou or fished up there and you liked it or you want to do it in the future, it's something you should pay attention to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really tough because on one side it's like you have the Greenpeace types, on the other side you have the not really using the wildlife or the fish. It's just mineral extraction or resource extraction. But the vast majority of people are in the middle. And so on individual issues, it's like we're on one side and then we're kind of on the other. So it's like, yeah, in certain cases, mining makes a lot of sense. We should do it. Logging, the second growth management, like totally fine. I think that messaging has become so much more nuanced and clear that you are pro fishing, pro hunting, also pro habitat. That doesn't put you on the Greenpeace side. That doesn't put you on the drill baby drill side. It puts you on this, hey, let's look at each thing individually and what is the best decision to be made. So these rollbacks are a little bit concerning because it was kind of done with that good faith discussion and how do we meet both of these needs and how do we go forward in a way that's going to benefit the most people.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And yeah, we definitely need to be thinking about more about compromise and being less divisive these days, trying to work together. And I think that plan for the central Yukon area did a good job of that. But for me, besides just the sort of impacts to the environment of potential opening up the land to mining and that sort of thing, it's actually the maybe cutting off opportunity for access for hunters. I'm thinking about like the Prudhoe Bay area, where all the oil fields are. You're not allowed to hunt there, right? Because it's a security risk. They can't have people running around there. Let's say there's a new mine or oil field that opens up in one of these lands, like where I like to go hunt or fish for the pumpkin char for Dolly Varden there. Those lands will potentially be opened for leasing. And so we might see fences pop up. And that scares me a lot because I have all these great spots up there that I want to go back to and I want my kids to go to, and it would just be a real shame if the one great accessible area we have in the Brooks Range through the Dalton Highway, we could lose access there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's definitely a balance to be had, though. There's already, a fair bit of mining and oil exploration in this area along the Dalton Highway corridor. But we have this great system now where you can bow hunt along the road and you can hike out or float out or dog sled out 5 miles and use your rifle to get a caribou. And you don't have to run into fences. You don't have to, have to worry about a lot of the other people around you. And you can have a pretty good chance of having success for catching an Arctic char, a caribou, a Dolly Varden, that sort of thing. But that could be changing in the future. So we just need to keep an eye on it. The 2024 resource management plan basically took those lands right along the Dalton Highway and said, these should be kept for sportsmen because they are accessible to the road. There's fewer and fewer opportunities on the road system now for caribou hunting. Like near Fairbanks, the 40-mile caribou herd, like we've had a hell of a time trying to get opportunities there because of the herd going up and down, and they close the season for 24 hours, or they open it for 24 hours, close it again. So the Dalton Highway is one place we still have a really reliable, even though it's challenging, place to go get caribou. And that plan was hoping to maintain that. If we roll that back, there's not a whole lot of other great places we can get over-the-counter caribou tags for residents or non-residents other than that Dalton Highway. So I think it's worth fighting for there, trying to keep our access.
Yeah. Does this make you a little bit more worried about Pebble? Because Pebble's kind of the iconic fight for habitat in Alaska, probably more so than Tongass National Forest, the roadless rule. But Pebble just keeps on popping up, and to this point, it's been beaten back. But do these rollbacks make you a little bit more concerned for the future of Pebble?
I think there's just such strong grassroots opposition to Pebble that's never really going to fly because you have such a united front between commercial fishermen, hunters and fishers. Even the politicians in Alaska got on board with that because it was so popular, right? Like, I don't think there's too much of worry for that now. I think maybe groups like Trout Unlimited and others would say, no, we need to stay vigilant with that. Yeah, but yeah, I think that Pebble mine, hopefully the fight is over for a little while, but it's hard to tell because all these projects keep coming back up, even things like the Susitna Dam or something, which is a terrible idea. Those still pop up now and then. So I wish I could say some of these things we won't see again, but we probably will. And we just got to keep making sure we're watching and looking out for our fish and wildlife and our hunting and fishing opportunities. Yeah, I don't know. There's it's like whack-a-mole. Something
Yeah,
comes
right.
up that you have to chase down every other year. So we just have to not get too apathetic as outdoors people and try to, we get bombarded with stop this, save that, blah, 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 right? But especially if it's something that somewhere you've gone and spent time in and value, it is worth trying to stay plugged in and not sort of giving up because it can be tough not to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the value in the organizations that are on top of these things is super important. So supporting Trout Unlimited, like becoming a member and just saying, hey, I know I trust that you're going to do with my dues what needs to happen. So I don't have to track this as much. I don't have to donate to a separate whatever thing or put more money. Just, hey, I agree with what you're doing. I support what you're doing. I know my money is going to go to the right place. What are some of the other organizations that have been active in fighting, advocating, helping out, and good kind of bang for your buck memberships?
Yeah, I think, the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, they do a great job nationally and in Alaska of, basically working towards compromise. They're out there for the hunters and anglers, but they're not necessarily they're not like ideologues one side or the other. So their initiative they're working on now, Hunters and Anglers for the Brooks Range, which is sort of an Ambler Road initiative. That's a great one to subscribe to, get information from, donate to. And, I've always been partial to backcountry hunters and anglers because it's sort of poor folks using their legs like I do rather than, a lot of rich folks flying in and going to banquets, but also very vocal for conservation and out there in the backcountry. So I really rate BHA highly as well. And Trout Unlimited, they do an amazing job with Pebble, for example, and the Tongass. They're so plugged in there, ready to go if there's any sort of threats to our opportunities and our fish and wildlife there. So
Yeah.
yeah, those organizations can't say enough good things about.
I really like the BHA's. I wouldn't say rebranded, but at first it was all about members, and they had a ton of members. But then it was like, well, what are we doing? I think the directors have done a great job of kind of consolidating the messaging, and then have really shown the evidence of what they're involved in, and I think that's what's really important. And I think the people who had an initial bad impression of BHA have come around. They're seeing that it's a really good conservation organization.
Yeah, I think so. It's evolved a lot, and it still had a lot of that grassroots draw where people were mad about the bigger conservation organizations like NRA or Safari Club just not being good advocates for hunters and anglers all the time. And so there was a niche there where people could be vocal about what they cared about and also, you know, build a community. And I think it still has that, and it's evolved a little bit more to be more mature now. So it's nice.
Mhm. So maybe transitioning back to some fun stuff as you're closing up. What's on your hunting or fishing schedule?
Yeah, I don't have anything too much, but I drew a Grand Canyon float permit for next year. So I'm really excited to do that. I've never been to the Grand Canyon National Park. So, you know, hard at work going through all the logistics and planning for that, which I love to do. We're all good at that as Alaskans. We hang out in the wintertime going over maps and reports and stuff, trying to plot our next adventure. And so that's right down my alley. I'm just gathering information and sort of plotting to do that trip. And I'm super excited about it. Never been to that national park and going to try to do it with Packcraft, which, you can't carry quite as much stuff, but you can be a little more, I don't know, a little more flexible and that sort of thing and mobile. So there's Alpaca Raft Company has a great blog about how to pack raft the Grand Canyon. So just using resources like that to figure it out. And super excited to see a new area of our public lands. For Alaska, my quest in life is to float all 25 of Alaska's wild and scenic rivers, and I've got 10 of them done. So I'm
Wow.
hoping to knock out maybe one more next year. This year, I tried to do the Charlie River, and with all the forest fires around Fairbanks, our pilots ended up canceling on us. So ended up doing the Golcana River again instead, which is a wonderful river to float and fish. But hoping to check out a new river like the Charlie or the Tiniaguk, which you can fly into Anaktuvuk Pass and then float down to Bettles. Very, very budget friendly, like $180, I think, to fly to Anaktuvik, and about the same to fly back for Bettles. This is this area where a lot of people say it's too expensive to access. I would definitely argue otherwise. But
Yeah.
so yeah, those are on my list. I'm hoping to do a couple of those, and then with my fisheries work, summer is super busy for me. So I'll be in the Koyukuk drainage studying chum salmon, ways that the populations there are not doing well. So seeing pop, you know, possible causes of mortality. We're looking at diseases and then also warming water. Sometimes that warm water puts a lot of stress on them, and the adult salmon get up to their spawning grounds, but they can't quite complete the final mission. And you find a salmon that's full of eggs in its belly. We call that pre-spawn mortality. This female salmon made it all the way to the finish line, but couldn't quite finish the deal. And so trying to get at rates of that and then also causes, I think will be really important, because we're seeing not only in the Koyukuk and Yukon drainages, but in the Kobuk drainage too now. These chum salmon populations are declining a bit. So anything we can do to figure out what's going on. I think a lot of the problems are out in saltwater, not so much freshwater, but it's all part of the puzzle. So those things, it's going to be a busy summer next year.
Yeah, I looked at some of the pictures of the old Chinook salmon that are 50, 60, 70 pounds that are just completely colored up, and you think, man, that thing is like hours from spawning. But now, I mean, is the meat even good to eat? And good, it was totally legal. You caught your fish, and good for you. Got this great picture, this epic fish. But now with the populations being what they are, you can't help but look back and think, man, that's one of them. There were a ton, and that's not the only thing. It's not Joe from New Jersey's fault that the Kenai River has so many fewer of those fish, but it's one of the things.
It's true. I'm guilty of that. When I was younger, I kept one large Chinook salmon from the Salter River near Fairbanks, totally legal to keep it. And I smoked it up and it tasted great, but I kind of regret it because that fish swam like 900 miles and almost finished its project. I don't feel bad catching them in saltwater, but when they're almost to the end like that, I kind of felt bad. But yeah, I'm smarter now, and every time I catch one of those salmon, when the opportunities present itself, I usually do that catch and release or go after other fish species. But one group that I'm involved with, the Midnight Sun Flycasters, which is like a fly fishing organization in Fairbanks there, we put forth a regulations proposal that says if you're catching Chinook salmon, when you're not keeping it, you need to keep it in the water, in the Tanana River and the Yukon River. You can't remove it from the water for a photo. You have to keep it in that water. Studies have shown that catch and release is way more effective if you don't take that fish out of the water. You keep it in there. So sort of like the keep them wet thing. So hopefully I've evolved to do more of my part. If people catch those Chinook salmon incidentally, they're mostly closed for recreational fishing now. But if they open up in the future, if people are not keeping them to eat, then they need to keep them in the water and let them go. And that was a regulation that our angling club put forward and was approved. So super proud of that. But yeah, I just got an article out in Trout Unlimited about some of these salmon declines in the Yukon River and how it affects not only salmon and people, but also like grayling and Dolly Varden, because those fish depend on all the nutrients that those salmon bring in, just like down in your neck of the woods, right? The salmon forest, where there's all these marine nutrients that come up into the forest and boost productivity for everything. It's similar around Fairbanks, just not to the same degree. So everything's hurting with those salmon declines, and hopefully we can figure things out a little bit and help them on their way to recovery.
Yeah. Where can people find out more information? Websites? Are there interesting things that are coming up that people need to be aware of? Are there people input type things? What's on your radar as far as being involved?
Yeah, so if you're a person who hunts and fishes along that Dalton Highway zone, or you plan to, or you know somebody who wants to, take a look at this Central Yukon Resource Management Plan and the resolution in Congress right now that's attempting to roll that back, and consider writing a letter to your representative, whichever state you're in. This is a federal project, so Alaska, anywhere in the U.S., this is everybody's land and everybody's opportunities for those caribou. So consider writing something if you value those hunting opportunities. Otherwise, yeah, the Midnight Sun Flycasters is a cool follow on Facebook if you want to learn more about like some of the northern Alaska fish, like the pumpkin char and the Dolly Varden char. And then I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society and have a fisheries website there, but it's a little hard to navigate to. So I'll just leave that there for now. But yeah, I think that's my top recommendations at the moment.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot for coming on here. Really nice chatting with you, and it really makes me want to head back up there at some point to get up there after some fish.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite trips. And I mean, if folks have seen photos of some of those char or the Dolly Varden, they both have their own incredible beauty. Probably, in my opinion, the most colorful salmonids in the world. So I hope that folks can get up there and take advantage of catching them and enjoying them like I have.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Kevin. Have a good one.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Jeff.